A small hill tribe with no navy, no chariots to speak of, and no natural resources worth fighting over, survived being squeezed between the two most dangerous empires on earth, Egypt to the south and a rotating cast of Mesopotamian superpowers to the north. Every civilization that tried to crush them eventually turned to dust. Egypt fell into decline. Assyria was erased so completely its own capital was forgotten under sand for 2,000 years. Babylon burned Jerusalem to the ground, blinded its king, and marched its people into exile in chains. By every rule of ancient history, that should have been the end. It wasn't. What survived wasn't a kingdom or an army or a king. It was a book. And that book went on to shape the moral architecture of half the modern world. This is the archaeological record, the war inscriptions, and the buried cities that tell you what actually happened to the people the ancient world called the Hebrews, and how a nation that lost every war that mattered ended up outlasting every empire that beat them. Look at a map of the ancient Near East around 1300 BC, and one thing becomes immediately clear. The strip of land known as Canaan, running along the eastern Mediterranean coast, was not a place anyone wanted to control for its own sake. It was a corridor. Every army that marched between Egypt and Mesopotamia had to pass through it. Every trade caravan carrying grain, metal, or manufactured goods between the two ancient superpowers of the region had to cross it. Canaan's value was entirely geographic. It was the hallway connecting two houses, and whoever controlled the hallway controlled the traffic passing through it. This made Canaan a permanent battleground, contested primarily between Egypt's New Kingdom pharaohs and the Hittite Empire based in central Anatolia. Neither power wanted to fully absorb and administer this rocky, resource-poor territory. Both wanted to deny it to the other. The local city-states of Canaan, Megiddo, Hatzor, Lachish, Jerusalem itself in its earliest form, existed as vassal states, paying tribute to whichever great power currently held the upper hand, and playing a constant, dangerous game of hedging their loyalties. The Amarna letters, a cache of clay diplomatic correspondence discovered in Egypt and dated to the 14th century BC, give us a direct, unfiltered window into this world. These are not later religious texts written with hindsight and theology attached. They are panicked, real-time messages from Canaanite vassal kings to the Egyptian pharaoh, begging for military assistance against raiders and rival city-states. Repeatedly, these letters mention a group called the Habiru, a term describing bandits, mercenaries, and displaced peoples operating outside the control of any established city-state, attacking settlements and disrupting trade. Scholars have debated for a century whether this term is linguistically connected to the later word Hebrew. The connection is not certain, but the picture the letters paint, a landscape full of stateless, armed groups operating on the margins of established power, is exactly the kind of environment in which a new people could emerge. Then, around 1200 BC, the entire system collapsed. This is the event historians call the Bronze Age collapse, and it was not localized to Canaan. Across the eastern Mediterranean, in the span of a few decades, the great powers of the age fell apart almost simultaneously. The Hittite Empire disintegrated entirely. Mycenaean Greece collapsed into a dark age. Egypt survived, but was severely weakened, its ability to project military power into Canaan crippled for generations. The specific causes remain debated among historians. Climate change, mass migration, systems collapse triggered by interlocking trade dependencies, the mysterious raiders known as the Sea Peoples. But the effect on Canaan was unmistakable. A power vacuum opened where two competing empires had once maintained an uneasy but firm grip. It is in the wreckage of this collapse that we get the single earliest piece of hard, undisputed archaeological evidence for the existence of a people called Israel. The Merneptah Stele, a granite monument erected around 1208 BC by the Egyptian pharaoh Merneptah to commemorate his military campaigns, includes a line boasting that Israel is laid waste, his seed is not. This is not a friendly reference. It is a claim of destruction carved by an Egyptian king bragging about crushing a group he names specifically among a list of defeated Canaanite peoples and cities. But its significance to historians has nothing to do with Egyptian propaganda and everything to do with dating. This inscription proves that a group identifiable as Israel existed as a recognized entity in Canaan by 1208 BC, making it the earliest confirmed historical reference to this people found anywhere in the archaeological record, appearing centuries before any biblical text was likely composed. The archaeological survey evidence from this same period adds another critical piece to the picture. Excavations across the central highlands of Canaan, the rugged, less agriculturally desirable hill country running through what is now the West Bank, reveal something striking: the sudden appearance of more than 300 small settlements in territory that had previously been sparsely inhabited or empty. These were not built on the ruins of destroyed Canaanite cities. They were new foundations, established in marginal highland terrain that established Canaanite city-states had largely ignored because it required intensive labour, terracing hillsides, digging cisterns for water storage to make it agriculturally viable. Whoever these highland settlers were, they were not conquering heroes storming through with superior weapons. They were people willing to do the hard, unglamorous work of turning difficult terrain into something that could sustain a population, precisely at the moment when the collapse of the old imperial order made that kind of quiet, unsupervised settlement possible for the first time in generations. The people settling the Canaanite highlands in the 12th and 11th centuries BC left behind a very specific architectural signature that archaeologists have used to track their spread and distinguish them from surrounding populations: the four-room house. This distinctive floor plan, a rectangular structure divided into 3 or 4 long spaces, typically with a central courtyard flanked by rooms on either side, all opening onto a broad room at the rear, appears with striking consistency across highland settlement sites and becomes, over time, something close to a cultural fingerprint. It was practical architecture, well suited to the mixed agricultural and pastoral economy of highland life, with separate spaces for storage, living quarters, and livestock. Its consistent appearance across hundreds of otherwise independent, scattered settlements suggests a shared cultural tradition binding these communities together even in the absence of any central political authority. An equally revealing piece of evidence comes not from architecture, but from garbage. Archaeologists excavating the refuse pits and waste deposits of these highland settlements have found something consistently and conspicuously absent: pig bones. Across the broader Canaanite world of this period, pig husbandry was common, and pig bones appear regularly in settlement waste. In the highland sites associated with early Israel, they essentially do not. This dietary distinction, whether rooted in religious prohibition, practical herding logistics suited to highland terrain, or a deliberate marker of group identity distinguishing these communities from their Canaanite and Philistine neighbours, gives archaeologists one of their clearest material tools for identifying and tracking the spread of this specific highland population, separate from any later religious text describing dietary law. Politically, these highland communities operated without kings. The biblical tradition calls this the period of the judges, and whatever the precise historical accuracy of individual stories from that tradition, the underlying political structure it describes matches what archaeology would predict. A loose tribal confederation, with authority resting in local clan elders and occasional military leaders who rose to prominence during specific crises and then receded back into ordinary tribal life once the immediate threat had passed. This was not a state. It had no capital, no standing army, no centralized tax collection. It was a network of related communities bound by shared culture, shared dietary practice, and, increasingly, as the archaeological and later textual record suggests, a shared religious tradition, but with no political mechanism for unified action beyond voluntary cooperation in moments of extreme danger. That danger arrived from the coast. Around the same period that the highland settlements were expanding, a new population was establishing itself along the Mediterranean shoreline of Canaan. The Philistines, generally identified as one component of the broader confederation of maritime raiders and migrants that Egyptian sources call the Sea Peoples. Unlike the highland settlers, the Philistines arrived as organized, militarily sophisticated newcomers, founding a pentapolis of 5 major fortified cities: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath, along the coastal plain. Archaeological evidence from these sites shows distinctive pottery styles connected to the Aegean world, supporting the idea that this population had cultural roots in the collapsing Mycenaean sphere before relocating to the Levantine coast in the chaos following the Bronze Age collapse. The critical strategic advantage the Philistines held over their highland neighbours was metallurgical. The Philistines had access to ironworking technology and appear to have guarded that technological edge carefully, while the highland Israelite communities remained dependent primarily on bronze, a metal requiring tin which had to be imported from distant sources through trade networks that the regional chaos of the Bronze Age collapse had severely disrupted. This was not a minor technical detail. Iron weapons held a sharper edge longer than bronze and could be produced from ore sources far more widely available than the tin required for bronze production. A fighting force equipped with iron weapons held a genuine, significant advantage over one still relying primarily on bronze, and as Philistine expansion pushed inland from the coastal plain into the highland frontier during the 11th century BC, this technological gap became an existential problem for the loosely organized highland tribes standing in their path. Sustained military pressure has a way of forcing political change on populations that would otherwise prefer to remain decentralized, and the escalating Philistine threat of the 11th century BC did exactly that to the highland tribes of Canaan. A confederation of clans, led by rotating local elders and occasional charismatic war leaders, could mount an effective response to an isolated raid. It could not mount a sustained defense against a militarily sophisticated, iron-equipped enemy conducting projected, coordinated campaigns into highland territory. Survival required something the tribal confederacy had never possessed: a single military commander with the authority to call up and coordinate fighters across multiple tribal groups on a standing rather than emergency basis. That commander, according to the tradition that later crystallized into the Hebrew Bible, was Saul, a figure whose historical reality is generally accepted by scholars, even where specific narrative details remain debated. What matters from a strategic standpoint is the kind of monarchy Saul represented. This was not the grand, centralized administration of Egypt or the great Mesopotamian kingdoms. It was, in essence, a permanent war leadership imposed onto a tribal confederacy that had never before needed one, built around the specific, urgent problem of countering Philistine military pressure. The military reality facing Saul's forces shaped everything about how this early kingdom fought. Highland Israelite fighters, still largely equipped with bronze weapons, against an iron-armed Philistine military, could not risk open, set-piece battles on level ground, where Philistine equipment and organized infantry tactics would deliver a decisive advantage. Instead, the terrain itself became the primary weapon. The rugged, broken highland landscape, narrow passes, steep wadis, terrain that Philistine chariots and heavy infantry struggled to navigate effectively, allowed Saul's forces to fight an ambush-based, hit-and-run campaign, striking Philistine columns in terrain where numbers and equipment mattered less than local knowledge and mobility. Saul's capital reflected the modest, military character of this new state. Gibeah, identified by archaeologists with a hilltop site north of Jerusalem, was not a grand administrative city with palaces and monumental architecture. It was, based on the excavated remains, essentially a fortified military strongpoint, functional, defensible, built for the practical necessities of coordinating a tribal war effort rather than projecting the kind of royal grandeur that later Israelite and Judahite kings would eventually pursue. This was kingship stripped down to its most basic function: organized violence in defense of the highland communities that had, out of desperation rather than any deep enthusiasm for monarchy, agreed to accept a single commander's authority. The strategy of avoiding open battle could not be sustained indefinitely, and the war eventually reached the kind of decisive confrontation that guerrilla tactics are specifically designed to prevent. At Mount Gilboa, Saul's forces were drawn into direct battle with the Philistine army, and the result was catastrophic. Saul and his sons, including his heir Jonathan, were killed in the fighting. The nascent highland monarchy, barely established, was thrown immediately into crisis. Its founding king dead, its military leadership shattered, and the tribal confederation that had reluctantly united behind him now facing the very real prospect of fragmenting back into disconnected, vulnerable clan groups, precisely at the moment when Philistine military pressure remained as dangerous as ever. Into this vacuum stepped a figure who had already built an independent reputation and power base entirely separate from Saul's court: David, a former commander in Saul's own military who had, in the years before Gilboa, fallen out with the king and spent time operating as a mercenary captain, at one point reportedly leading a band of fighters in the service of a Philistine ruler, a detail preserved in the biblical tradition that historians find plausible precisely because it is politically embarrassing and unlikely to have been invented. With Saul dead and the northern tribal leadership in disarray, David moved to consolidate control over the southern territory of Judah, using the military reputation and the network of loyal fighters he had built during his years as an independent operator to establish a power base that Saul's shattered dynasty could not contest. David's consolidation of power did not happen through a single decisive stroke. It unfolded over years, beginning with control over Judah in the south and gradually extending through a combination of military reputation, political marriage, and the sheer exhaustion of rival factions after Saul's death, to encompass the northern tribes as well. Once that unification was achieved, David made a decision that would prove to be one of the most consequential pieces of political geography in the entire history of the region. He needed a capital that belonged to neither the northern nor the southern tribal factions specifically, a neutral centre that could not be claimed as the exclusive possession of any single tribal group. His solution was Jerusalem, at the time a fortified city controlled by the Jebusites, a Canaanite population that had maintained its independence throughout the tribal period, protected by defensive walls and a water system that had allowed it to resist absorption into the surrounding highland confederacy. David's forces captured the city, according to the tradition, using an assault route connected to its water shaft system, and David then established it as his personal capital, a city with no prior tribal allegiance, owned directly by the crown rather than inherited from any pre-existing tribal claim. This was shrewd political architecture. A capital belonging to no tribe belonged, functionally, to all of them equally, removing a potential source of resentment that might otherwise have fueled immediate rebellion from whichever tribal faction felt overlooked. David's military establishment reflected a similar logic of consolidating personal loyalty over tribal obligation. Rather than relying exclusively on levies drawn from the tribal confederacy, soldiers whose ultimate loyalty remained to their own clan leaders rather than to the king personally. David maintained a core of foreign mercenaries, identified in the tradition as Cherethites and Pelethites, likely drawn from Aegean or Philistine-adjacent populations. Foreign soldiers with no tribal stake in Israelite internal politics made for a personal guard whose loyalty depended entirely on the king's continued patronage, rather than on any competing tribal allegiance. A critical safeguard against the very real threat of internal rebellion that would, in fact, materialize repeatedly during David's later reign. Militarily, David's forces expanded well beyond simple defense against the Philistines, conducting campaigns against the neighboring kingdoms of Moab, Edom, and Ammon to the east and southeast. These campaigns were not primarily about territorial acreage. The value lay in controlling the trade routes running through this territory, connecting Arabian trade networks to the broader Mediterranean and Mesopotamian commercial systems. A kingdom that controlled these routes could tax the traffic passing through them, converting geographic position into steady economic revenue, rather than depending entirely on agricultural production from difficult highland terrain. For decades, the primary evidence for David's existence as a historical figure rested entirely on later biblical text, leading many scholars to treat him as a largely legendary founding figure, rather than a securely documented historical king. That changed dramatically in 1993 with the discovery of the Tel Dan Stele, a fragmentary basalt inscription found at the site of ancient Dan in northern Israel, commissioned by a king of the Aramean kingdom of Damascus, boasting of military victories over regional rivals. Among the defeated enemies named in the inscription's surviving fragments is a reference to the House of David, using David's name as the dynastic label for the ruling line of Judah, generations after his death. This was the first piece of hard, non-biblical archaeological evidence confirming that David was understood by his contemporaries and near-contemporaries in the region as the founder of a genuine, historically real royal dynasty, not a later literary invention. David's later reign, however, was defined less by external military triumph than by escalating internal chaos. His own household became the site of repeated succession crises, culminating in an open rebellion led by his son Absalom that forced David to flee his own capital before eventually being suppressed at great cost. The pattern of internal family conflict over succession would recur throughout David's final years, revealing a fundamental and unresolved weakness at the heart of the new monarchy. A kingdom built rapidly around the personal authority and military reputation of a single charismatic leader had no established, stable mechanism for transferring that authority to the next generation without triggering violent internal competition. Solomon's accession to David's throne did not happen smoothly or without bloodshed. The tradition describes a court purge in which rival claimants and their key supporters were systematically eliminated once Solomon's position was secured, a brutal but historically unsurprising pattern for consolidating power in a monarchy without any settled tradition of peaceful succession. What Solomon built once that consolidation was complete, however, represented a genuine transformation in the character of the state his father had founded, a shift from a war leadership organized around military necessity toward a genuinely centralized royal administration, with the accompanying bureaucratic infrastructure and, critically, the accompanying tax burden that centralized administration requires. Solomon's kingdom sat astride two of the most valuable trade corridors in the ancient Near East: the Via Maris, the coastal route connecting Egypt to Mesopotamia and Anatolia, and the King's Highway, the inland route running through Transjordan, connecting Arabian trade networks to Damascus and beyond. Controlling the junction points and way stations along these routes allowed Solomon's administration to tax the flow of goods moving through the kingdom without needing to produce those goods domestically, a strategically valuable position for a state built on rocky highland terrain with limited agricultural surplus of its own. The alliance Solomon cultivated with Hiram, king of the Phoenician city of Tyre, exemplifies this trade-based strategy. Tyre possessed skilled craftsmen, access to the prized cedar timber of Lebanon, and established maritime trading networks reaching across the Mediterranean, resources Solomon's kingdom needed for the monumental building projects he had planned. In exchange, Solomon's kingdom supplied wheat and olive oil, agricultural staples that a maritime trading city like Tyre, with limited farmland of its own, needed to import. This exchange gave Solomon access to Phoenician architectural expertise and materials, essential to construction projects far beyond what his own kingdom's craftsmen and resources could have produced independently. The archaeological evidence for Solomon's building program is genuinely impressive, whatever debates continue among scholars about the precise dating of specific structures. Excavations at Megiddo, Hazor, and Giza, three strategically critical fortress cities controlling key routes through the kingdom, reveal a distinctive architectural signature: monumental six-chambered gate complexes of remarkably consistent design, suggesting centralized royal planning and construction rather than independent local building efforts. These were not decorative structures. Six-chambered gates, with their multiple defensive checkpoints and controlled access points, represent serious military engineering designed to slow and channel any attacking force attempting to breach the city. Whether these specific structures date precisely to Solomon's reign remains a matter of ongoing archaeological and chronological debate, but the underlying pattern, a centralized authority capable of executing coordinated, standardized fortification projects across multiple cities simultaneously, points to a genuinely sophisticated state administration. The First Temple, Solomon's most famous construction project, has left no direct archaeological trace since its presumed location remains inaccessible to excavation beneath structures still sacred to multiple modern religious traditions. Its description in later textual tradition, however, incorporating imported cedar, skilled Phoenician craftsmanship, and elaborate metalwork, is entirely consistent with what the broader archaeological picture of Solomon's reign would predict: a kingdom investing heavily in monumental religious architecture as a tool of political legitimacy, centralizing worship and its accompanying economic activity around the royal capital, rather than allowing it to remain scattered across local tribal shrines. None of this monumental construction came without cost, and that cost fell most heavily on the ordinary population through a system of corvée labor, compulsory unpaid work service extracted from the kingdom's subjects to supply the manpower these massive building projects required. The later tradition specifically identifies the northern tribes as bearing a disproportionate share of this burden, a detail that historians find plausible precisely because it explains, with clean political logic, exactly why the northern tribes would prove so willing to break away entirely the moment Solomon's successor gave them sufficient provocation. Centralized monarchy had delivered genuine wealth, impressive fortifications, and a magnificent temple. It had also planted, through the accumulated resentment of forced labor and heavy taxation, the seeds of the kingdom's first and most consequential fracture. When Solomon died, the northern tribal leadership approached his son and successor, Rehoboam, with a direct and specific demand: lighten the burden of taxation and forced labor that Solomon's building projects had imposed, and they would continue to accept the united monarchy under his rule. This was not a radical demand. It was, in effect, an offer of continued loyalty in exchange for a return to less punishing terms of rule. Rehoboam's response, according to the tradition, was to reject his father's older, more experienced advisor's counsel toward moderation, and instead follow the advice of younger courtiers, urging him to demonstrate strength by threatening even harsher treatment than his father had imposed. Whatever the precise historical accuracy of this specific exchange, The outcome that followed is not in serious dispute among historians. The northern tribes rejected Rehoboam's authority outright and broke away. The split, conventionally dated to around 930 BC, divided what had briefly been a unified kingdom into two separate states with starkly different resources and prospects. Israel, the northern kingdom, retained 10 of the 12 traditional tribal territories, including the most agriculturally productive land in the region and control over the critical Via Maris trade corridor. Judah, the southern kingdom, was left with a much smaller, poorer territory, centered almost entirely on Jerusalem and its immediate highland surroundings. In purely material terms, the north held nearly every advantage. The south held the capital city, the royal Davidic bloodline, and the temple, assets that carried enormous symbolic and religious weight, even as they conferred comparatively little immediate economic or military advantage. Egypt moved quickly to exploit this sudden fracture in a formerly unified regional power. Pharaoh Sheshonq I, identified with the biblical Shishak, launched a military campaign into the newly divided territory, and the raid is confirmed independently through an inscription carved into the walls of the Temple of Amun at Karnak in Egypt, listing captured cities across the region. This was not a campaign aimed at permanent conquest and occupation. It was an opportunistic raid designed to extract wealth and demonstrate Egyptian regional power precisely at the moment when the political disunity of the newly split kingdoms made resistance far less likely to succeed effectively. For Jeroboam, the northern kingdom's founding king, the religious dimension of the split posed a specific and pressing political problem. Jerusalem, with its temple, remained the traditional religious center for the entire former United Kingdom, and if northern subjects continued making pilgrimage there for major religious festivals, that steady traffic risked gradually eroding loyalty back towards the Davidic dynasty in the south. Jeroboam's solution was to establish alternative religious centers within his own northern kingdom, at Dan in the far north and Bethel near the border with Judah, each featuring a golden calf image, a decision that later religious tradition condemned harshly as idolatrous apostasy, but which functioned from a purely political standpoint as a calculated and entirely rational attempt to keep religious loyalty and the pilgrimage traffic and revenue that came with it contained within his own kingdom's borders. What followed the split was not a clean, permanent separation, but decades of intermittent warfare between the two kingdoms, as border territories changed hands repeatedly and each side sought to weaken or reabsorb the other. This was, in the starkest possible terms, civil war between two states that had until recently been a single unified nation under a single royal house, a conflict that consumed resources and manpower on both sides that might otherwise have been directed towards the external threats steadily accumulating on every side of both kingdoms' borders. The northern kingdom of Israel, for all its material advantages over Judah, inherited a specific and dangerous structural weakness from its founding: no stable, universally recognized mechanism for royal succession comparable to Judah's unbroken Davidic bloodline. Where Judah's kings, whatever their individual competence, could generally claim an unbroken hereditary legitimacy tracing back to David, Israel's throne changed hands repeatedly through military coup and violent usurpation during its early decades, a pattern of instability that continued until a military commander named Omri seized power through exactly this kind of bloody internal struggle and, remarkably, managed to establish a dynasty stable and successful enough to leave a lasting mark on the historical record far beyond the borders of Israel itself. Omri's most significant and enduring decision was the founding of a new capital at Samaria. Rather than working with an existing settlement, the biblical tradition describes Omri purchasing an entire hill outright and constructing his capital from the ground up on a site chosen specifically for its exceptional defensive qualities, commanding terrain that made any potential siege extraordinarily difficult and costly for an attacking force. Archaeological excavation at Samaria confirms sophisticated, high-quality royal construction, including finely dressed masonry and administrative buildings reflecting genuine wealth and skilled engineering capacity, consistent with a dynasty possessing far greater resources and organizational stability than Israel's earlier, more chaotic royal history would have predicted. Omri's reputation and impact extended well beyond his own kingdom's borders, a fact confirmed independently through the Merneptah Stele, an inscription commissioned by a king of neighboring Moab and discovered in the 19th century. The inscription describes, from the Moabite perspective, decades of harsh subjugation under Omri and his dynasty, and Moab's eventual successful rebellion to throw off that control. This is a genuinely valuable historical source precisely because it is hostile testimony. A rival kingdom's own account describing Omri's power in terms of bitter resentment at Israelite domination rather than any Israelite court flattery, and thereby independently confirming the real regional influence the Omride dynasty had established. Omri's son and successor, Ahab, extended this policy of building regional power through strategic marriage alliance, taking as his wife Jezebel, daughter of the king of Sidon, a major Phoenician trading city. This alliance connected Israel's agricultural wealth and inland trade routes to the sophisticated maritime commercial networks of Phoenicia, strengthening the kingdom's economic position considerably, though it also imported religious and cultural tensions that later tradition would treat as a central source of internal conflict and eventual divine judgment against the dynasty. The clearest independent confirmation of just how significant Israelite military power had become under Ahab comes not from any Israelite or biblical source at all, but from an Assyrian inscription describing the Battle of Karkar in 853 BC. Facing the westward expansion of the Assyrian Empire under Shalmaneser III, a coalition of regional states banded together to resist, and the Assyrian king's own inscription, in a characteristic display of imperial boasting, even while describing what was likely an inconclusive engagement, specifically credits Ahab of Israel with contributing 2,000 chariots to the Allied coalition force, an extraordinarily large chariot contingent by the military standards of the period, larger than the contributions credited to several other named coalition members combined. This single inscription, written by Israel's eventual conqueror generations before that conquest occurred, stands as powerful independent testimony that the Northern Kingdom, under Omride rule, had become a genuinely formidable regional military power in its own right, not the marginal, peripheral highland state its geography might otherwise suggest. The Omride dynasty's regional power, for all its genuine achievements, proved unable to escape the same fundamental instability that had plagued Israel's monarchy from its founding. A military commander named Jehu, backed by conservative religious factions deeply hostile to the Phoenician religious influences Jezebel had introduced into the royal court, launched a violent coup that eliminated Ahab's entire royal line in a systematic, deliberately thorough purge. A bloody transfer of power entirely consistent with the pattern of dynastic instability that had characterized the Northern Kingdom since its founding split from Judah. The historical reality of Jehu's coup and the significant cost it carried for Israel's regional standing is documented in strikingly vivid form through the black obelisk of Shalmaneser III, an Assyrian monument now held in the British Museum that includes a carved relief depicting Jehu personally prostrating himself before the Assyrian king, accompanied by an inscription describing tribute paid in gold, silver, and other valuable goods. This is a remarkable piece of direct visual evidence, an actual carved image of an Israelite king submitting in person to Assyrian authority, created by the Assyrians themselves as a monument to their own regional dominance. Whatever internal religious legitimacy Jehu's coup carried within Israel, it came at the direct cost of Israel's independent standing as a regional power, forcing the new king into open, humiliating submission to Assyrian authority within the very same period Israel had previously been building serious military coalitions capable of standing up to Assyrian expansion. This moment of weakness, arriving precisely when Israel had lost its previous regional alliance network built under the Omrides, created an opening that the neighboring Aramean kingdom of Damascus moved aggressively to exploit. Under King Hazael, Aramean forces launched a sustained series of invasions into Israelite territory, capturing cities and stripping away substantial portions of the kingdom's land, particularly in the strategically and agriculturally valuable regions east of the Jordan River. The biblical tradition describes these campaigns in genuinely stark terms, recording that Israel's military capacity was reduced at one devastating low point to a mere 10 chariots and 50 horsemen. Almost complete collapse from the 2,000 chariots Ahab had commanded barely a generation earlier at Karkar. Aramean military strategy during this period of dominance appears to have deliberately incorporated economic devastation alongside direct battlefield engagement. Burning agricultural fields, destroying orchards and vineyards that took years to mature and could not be quickly replaced, and systematically targeting the productive capacity of Israelite territory, rather than simply seeking direct military confrontation. This kind of scorched earth campaigning inflicted damage that persisted for years after any specific military engagement had ended, crippling the kingdom's capacity for economic recovery, even in years without active fighting, and helping explain the severity and duration of Israel's military weakness during this extended period. Israel's fortunes eventually turned, though not primarily through any dramatic Israelite military triumph. The Aramean kingdom of Damascus itself came under sustained pressure from a resurgent Assyrian empire, forcing Hazael's successors to redirect military resources and attention away from their campaigns against Israel and toward their own kingdom's survival against Assyrian expansion. This regional shift created renewed opportunity, and under King Jeroboam II, Israel experienced a genuine, if ultimately temporary, economic and territorial recovery, reclaiming lost territory and enjoying several decades of renewed prosperity. A recovery built less on any fundamental improvement in Israel's underlying strategic position than on the specific, temporary good fortune of watching its most immediate regional rival become consumed by a far more dangerous threat approaching from Mesopotamia. The temporary regional stability that had allowed Jeroboam II's Israel to recover lost ground came to an abrupt end with the accession of Tiglath-Pileser III to the Assyrian throne in 745 BC, a ruler whose military and administrative reforms would transform Assyria from a formidable but periodically distracted regional power into the most efficient, terrifying, and relentless military machine the ancient Near East had yet produced. Tiglath-Pileser III's reforms went well beyond simple battlefield tactics. He established what amounted to the ancient world's first genuinely professional standing army, maintained year-round rather than assembled seasonally from agricultural levies, equipped increasingly with iron weaponry that had by this point spread widely beyond the earlier Philistine monopoly. His forces incorporated sophisticated siege technology, including specialized battering rams and engineered assault ramps capable of systematically breaching even well-fortified highland cities that had previously relied on defensible terrain as their primary protection. Perhaps most consequentially for conquered populations, he formalized and expanded a policy of mass population deportation, deliberately uprooting entire conquered peoples from their homeland and resettling them in distant regions of the empire, specifically to prevent the kind of generational nationalist resentment that might otherwise fuel future rebellion. The immediate crisis this new Assyrian threat created for the two Hebrew kingdoms unfolded through what historians call the Syro-Ephraimite War. Facing Assyrian expansion, Israel and the Aramean kingdom of Damascus, recent bitter enemies now finding common cause against a far more dangerous shared threat, formed a defensive coalition and attempted to compel Judah to join their anti-Assyrian alliance by force, laying siege to Jerusalem itself in an effort to remove the reigning Judahite king and install a more cooperative replacement willing to join their coalition. King Ahaz of Judah, facing this coordinated pressure from his own regional neighbours, made a decision that later religious tradition would condemn in the harshest possible terms, but that represented, from a purely tactical survival standpoint, a coldly rational calculation. Rather than joining the anti-Assyrian coalition, he sent tribute directly to Tiglath-Pileser III, including gold stripped from the Jerusalem temple treasury, explicitly requesting Assyrian military intervention against his own regional neighbours, Israel and Damascus. This was, in effect, deliberately inviting the single most dangerous military power in the ancient world directly into the middle of a regional conflict. A desperate gamble, but one that succeeded in its immediate objective of relieving the siege of Jerusalem. The Assyrian response arrived with characteristic and overwhelming force. Tiglath-Pileser III's armies moved against Damascus directly, capturing and destroying the Aramean capital, executing its king, and formally annexing the kingdom's territory as a directly administered Assyrian province, permanently erasing an independent Aramean Damascus from the political map of the ancient Near East. Israel, though not conquered outright in this particular campaign, was stripped of substantial northern and Transjordanian territory, which the Assyrians organized into new provinces under direct imperial administration, leaving the northern kingdom a drastically reduced, weakened rump state, clinging to survival immediately on the doorstep of an empire that had just demonstrated, with brutal clarity, exactly what awaited any regional power that resisted its authority. Israel's severely reduced territory following Tiglath-Pileser III's campaigns did not translate into lasting caution among its subsequent rulers. King Hoshea, Israel's final monarch, made a fateful decision to stop paying the tribute that had kept Assyrian forces at bay, instead reaching out to Egypt in a bid for military support against continued Assyrian domination, a calculated gamble on the assumption that Egyptian assistance would provide sufficient counterweight to withstand the inevitable Assyrian retaliation this defiance would provoke. That assumption proved catastrophically wrong. Egypt, weakened and internally divided during this period of its own history, never delivered the promised military support, leaving Israel to face the full, undivided weight of Assyrian retaliation entirely alone. The siege of Samaria that followed, conducted first under Shalmaneser V and completed under his successor Sargon II, lasted approximately 3 grinding years, during which the city's population endured severe famine conditions as Assyrian forces systematically cut off supply routes and starved the defenders into eventual, inevitable submission. When the city finally fell in 722 BC, Assyrian forces conducted a brutal, thorough conquest, and the northern kingdom of Israel, after roughly 2 centuries of independent existence, ceased to exist as a political entity. What followed the military conquest was, in some respects, even more consequential for the long-term historical fate of the northern kingdom's population than the siege itself. A policy of systematic, deliberate mass deportation. Assyrian records indicate that more than 27,000 people, specifically targeting the educated, skilled, and administratively useful segments of Israelite society, including craftsmen, scribes, and members of the local elite, were forcibly relocated to distant regions of the Assyrian Empire, scattered across Mesopotamia, while foreign populations from other conquered territories were correspondingly resettled into the newly emptied Israelite territory in their place. This deliberate policy of population replacement and dispersal produced two lasting historical consequences that continue to resonate. The deported population scattered in small groups across a vast empire, with no concentrated territorial base from which to maintain cohesive group identity across subsequent generations, gradually assimilated into the broader populations surrounding them, becoming, in later tradition, the so-called 10 lost tribes of Israel, their specific fate and eventual cultural absorption never definitively traced by any surviving historical record. Meanwhile, the mixed population that emerged in the Northern Territory itself, combining the remaining original Israelite inhabitants who had not been deported with the foreign populations Assyria had resettled there, developed over subsequent generations into a distinct religious and ethnic community, the Samaritans, who maintained their own version of Israelite religious tradition and their own sacred sites, developing an increasingly contentious and often outright hostile relationship with the surviving southern kingdom of Judah that would persist for many centuries to come. The northern kingdom's fall left Judah in an entirely new and precarious strategic position. For roughly 2 centuries, Judah had existed in the considerable shadow of its larger, wealthier, more militarily powerful northern neighbour, a smaller, poorer kingdom that had nonetheless benefited from having Israel absorb the brunt of regional military pressure and serve as a buffer against threats approaching from the north. With Israel erased from the map entirely and its territory now under direct Assyrian administrative control, Judah stood alone for the first time in its history, sharing a direct, exposed border with the most powerful and militarily aggressive empire the ancient Near Eastern world had yet produced, with no larger neighbouring kingdom left to absorb the initial shock of any future confrontation. The catastrophic fall of the northern kingdom sent waves of refugees flooding southward into Judah, and the archaeological evidence for this sudden demographic transformation is genuinely dramatic. Excavations indicate that Jerusalem's populated area expanded by a factor of 4 or 5 within a remarkably short span of time following Samaria's fall, as refugees fleeing Assyrian conquest and deportation sought safety within the walls of the one remaining independent Hebrew kingdom. This sudden influx transformed Jerusalem from a relatively modest highland capital into a genuinely substantial regional city, while simultaneously creating urgent new pressures regarding food supply, water access, and defensive capacity that Judah's existing infrastructure had never been designed to handle. King Hezekiah, ruling Judah during this critical transitional period, made a consequential and dangerous political decision. Upon learning of the death of the formidable Assyrian king Sargon II, killed, according to surviving records, in battle under circumstances significant enough that Assyrian sources themselves treat his death and the failure to properly recover his body as a matter of serious religious and political concern, Hezekiah calculated that the resulting uncertainty and potential succession instability within the Assyrian imperial court created a viable opportunity to stop paying tribute and assert genuine independence from Assyrian authority. Anticipating the near-certain Assyrian military response this defiance would eventually provoke, Hezekiah undertook one of the most impressive engineering achievements attributed to any ancient Hebrew king: the construction of a water tunnel, now known as Hezekiah's Tunnel, cut through more than 500 meters of solid limestone bedrock to channel water from the Gihon Spring, located outside the existing city walls, safely into a pool located within Jerusalem's fortifications. This project solved a critical strategic vulnerability, A besieging army could otherwise simply cut off the city's external water access and force surrender through thirst alone, without ever needing to breach the walls directly. An inscription discovered within the tunnel itself, carved by the workers who completed the excavation, describes the genuinely remarkable technical achievement of two separate work crews digging from opposite ends and successfully meeting in the middle beneath the bedrock. A feat of ancient surveying and engineering precision that modern engineers examining the tunnel continue to find genuinely impressive. Hezekiah simultaneously undertook major defensive fortification projects, including construction of what archaeologists call the Broad Wall, a massive defensive structure measuring roughly 7 meters in thickness, built specifically to enclose and protect the newly expanded refugee settlement areas that had grown up on Jerusalem's western hill following the influx from the fallen northern kingdom. Excavation evidence indicates that constructing this wall required the deliberate demolition of existing residential structures to clear the necessary building footprint, a stark illustration of how completely military necessity had come to override ordinary civilian considerations as the Assyrian threat grew increasingly unavoidable. Alongside these physical preparations, Hezekiah pursued a program of religious centralization, ordering the destruction of local worship sites scattered throughout the countryside, the so-called high places, in favor of consolidating all sanctioned religious activity within the Jerusalem temple exclusively. Whatever the specific theological motivations behind this policy, its practical political effect was to concentrate religious authority and the pilgrimage traffic and associated economic activity that accompanied it more tightly under direct
royal control in the capital, reinforcing centralized state authority at precisely the moment when unified, coordinated resistance against the looming Assyrian threat had become an urgent matter of national survival rather than mere administrative preference. The Assyrian response to Hezekiah's defiance arrived under King Sennacherib, who launched a massive military campaign into Judah with a force ancient sources describe in numbers likely inflated for propaganda purposes, but that nonetheless represented, by any reasonable historical estimate, an overwhelming and comprehensive invasion force. Sennacherib's campaign methodically worked through Judah's fortified cities, and the most detailed and vivid surviving evidence of this campaign's brutal effectiveness comes from the conquest of Lachish, Judah's second most important fortified city, whose fall Assyrian artists commemorated in an extensive series of detailed stone relief carvings that once decorated Sennacherib's palace at Nineveh and can still be viewed today in the British Museum. These Lachish reliefs provide an extraordinarily detailed visual record of ancient siege warfare in action. Assyrian engineers constructing a massive earthen assault ramp against the city's fortified walls, archers providing covering fire for advancing infantry, defenders on the walls hurling projectiles down at the attackers below, and, in the relief's unflinchingly graphic final scenes, the aftermath of the city's fall, depicting captured inhabitants being led away into exile and, in several panels, the explicit impalement of captured defenders as calculated punishment and psychological warning intended for any other city contemplating similar resistance. With Lachish and numerous other fortified cities throughout Judah destroyed or forced into submission, Sennacherib's forces advanced to lay siege to Jerusalem itself. Sennacherib's own account of this campaign survives on a clay artifact known as the Sennacherib Prism, now held in the collection of the Oriental Institute in Chicago, which describes trapping Hezekiah within Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. A vivid, boastful phrase that nonetheless contains a critically important admission by omission. Nowhere in this otherwise extensively detailed and self-congratulatory inscription does Sennacherib actually claim to have captured Jerusalem itself. A conspicuous silence from a ruler who elsewhere boasted at considerable length and in exhaustive detail about every other city his forces successfully conquered during this same campaign.
What actually caused the Assyrian withdrawal from before Jerusalem's walls without completing the conquest remains one of the genuinely debated open questions in ancient Near Eastern historical scholarship. Possible explanations advanced by historians include a devastating outbreak of disease within the massed Assyrian camp, a credible military threat posed by an approaching Egyptian relief force requiring Sennacherib's attention elsewhere, or internal political instability brewing back in the Assyrian imperial heartland, requiring the king's urgent personal attention. Whatever the specific cause, the practical outcome was that Jerusalem survived the siege intact, while the rest of the kingdom paid an extraordinarily heavy price for that survival. Hezekiah's kingdom emerged from this catastrophic invasion severely diminished, but not destroyed. Sennacherib's own inscriptions describe stripping away substantial portions of Judahite territory and imposing a crushing tribute burden in gold, silver, and other valuable goods extracted directly from the royal treasury and the temple. Judah retained its king, its capital, its temple, and its formal independence, but only at the cost of accepting complete subordination as a heavily taxed Assyrian vassal state. A humiliating but nonetheless genuinely remarkable survival when measured against the total, permanent destruction that had befallen its northern sister kingdom just 2 decades earlier under nearly identical Assyrian pressure. The closing decades of the 7th century BC witnessed a dramatic and consequential shift in the balance of regional power, as the once seemingly unstoppable Assyrian Empire began to fracture under the combined weight of internal succession disputes and mounting external pressure from a resurgent Babylon, increasingly allied with the rising Median kingdom to the east. For Judah, watching this unfolding, Assyrian weakness from its position as a heavily taxed vassal state, the changing regional landscape offered a genuine, if ultimately temporary, opportunity for renewed independence and expansion. King Josiah seized this opening with real strategic ambition, extending Judahite control northward into portions of the former territory of the long-fallen northern kingdom of Israel, taking clear advantage of weakening Assyrian oversight in the region. Josiah's reign is equally notable for a significant religious development: the reported discovery during renovation work at the Jerusalem Temple of a scroll identified as the Book of the Law, a text that prompted a sweeping program of religious reform and centralization, and that many biblical scholars connect closely with an early form of the biblical book of Deuteronomy. Whatever its precise textual origins, this development functioned as a powerful tool for reinforcing centralized national and religious identity at a moment when renewed political independence made such unifying consolidation strategically valuable. Josiah's ambitions, however, led directly to his own downfall through a critical and ultimately fatal miscalculation regarding shifting regional alliances. In 609 BC, as Egyptian forces under Pharaoh Necho II marched northward specifically to support the crumbling remnant of the Assyrian Empire against the advancing Babylonian-Median coalition, Josiah moved to intercept and block the Egyptian army's passage through Judahite-controlled territory at Megiddo, a strategically critical choke point controlling movement between Egypt and Mesopotamia. The resulting battle proved catastrophic for Judah. Josiah was killed, likely by an Egyptian arrow, bringing an abrupt and violent end to a reign that had represented Judah's most significant and promising resurgence of independent power in generations. The regional order was then decisively reshaped just a few years later at the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BC. Where Babylonian forces under Nebuchadnezzar II comprehensively defeated the Egyptian army, permanently ending any realistic Egyptian hope of dominating the broader Near East, and firmly establishing Babylon as the new preeminent regional imperial power, directly inheriting the sphere of influence and vassal obligations the fading Assyrian Empire could no longer maintain. Judah, having briefly enjoyed a taste of genuine independence under Josiah, now found itself once again a subordinate vassal state, this time answering to a new and increasingly dangerous imperial master in Babylon, rather than the collapsing remnants of Assyria. Judah's final kings proved catastrophically unable to navigate this treacherous, new political landscape with the careful pragmatism that survival under great power domination genuinely required. King Jehoiakim, initially submitting to Babylonian authority as a tribute-paying vassal, subsequently and secretly attempted to negotiate parallel support from Egypt, a dangerously indecisive dual-track strategy that satisfied neither major power while simultaneously alienating both. This pattern of vacillating, ultimately self-defeating diplomacy between two hostile great powers, rather than any single dramatic military defeat, represented the single most consequential strategic failure of Judah's final years, setting the stage directly for the catastrophic Babylonian retaliation that was now becoming an increasingly unavoidable certainty. Babylonian patience with Judah's unreliable, wavering loyalty finally ran out in 597 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar II personally led a military campaign to besiege Jerusalem directly. The city capitulated relatively quickly under this initial pressure, and Nebuchadnezzar responded with a calculated, comparatively measured punishment rather than immediate total destruction. The reigning king and a substantial portion of Judah's political, religious, and skilled artisan elite were forcibly deported to Babylon, while Nebuchadnezzar installed a supposedly more compliant replacement ruler, Zedekiah, on Judah's throne in their place. A clear warning of the far more severe consequences that continued disloyalty would provoke, delivered while still preserving Judah's basic political structure and formal existence for the time being. That warning went entirely unheeded, encouraged by nationalist factions within his own court, who remained convinced that renewed Egyptian military support would prove decisive and perhaps calculating. That continued Babylonian preoccupation with challenges elsewhere across their sprawling empire created a viable opening. Zedekiah made the fateful decision to openly rebel against Babylonian authority. This proved to be a catastrophic, ultimately fatal strategic miscalculation. Egyptian support, exactly as it had failed Israel decades earlier before the fall of Samaria, once again failed to materialize in any form sufficient to meaningfully affect the military outcome that followed. Nebuchadnezzar's response was total and devastating. Babylonian forces settled into a siege of Jerusalem that stretched on for approximately 18 brutal months, systematically cutting off all external supply and reducing the trapped population within the city walls to conditions of severe, desperate famine. Conditions so extreme that the biblical tradition itself describes instances of cannibalism as starving residents were driven to unthinkable measures in a final, futile effort to survive. When Babylonian forces finally breached Jerusalem's fortifications in 586 BC, the destruction that followed was total and comprehensive. The royal palace was burned, the first temple, Solomon's temple, the religious and symbolic heart of the entire nation for nearly 4 centuries, was systematically destroyed down to its foundation stones, and every object of value that could be carried away was stripped and hauled off to Babylon as spoils of conquest. The specific punishment inflicted on King Zedekiah personally reflects the particular brutality Babylon reserved for rulers who had broken sworn vassal loyalty oaths. Captured attempting to flee the falling city, Zedekiah was forced to watch the execution of his own sons carried out directly before his eyes as a final, deliberate act of psychological cruelty. And only after enduring that horror was he then blinded, ensuring that the last image he would ever see for the remainder of his life was the killing of his own children. before being bound in chains and led away into permanent captivity in Babylon. With Jerusalem in ruins, its temple destroyed, its royal dynasty removed from the throne, and a substantial portion of its surviving population forcibly deported into exile, the Kingdom of Judah, the last independent surviving remnant of what had once been David and Solomon's unified Hebrew monarchy, effectively ceased to exist as a functioning political entity. By every historical precedent the ancient Near East had established across the preceding centuries, this should have marked the definitive, final end of the story. Another small kingdom crushed and permanently absorbed by a larger, more powerful empire. Its people scattered and gradually assimilated into the surrounding populations, its distinct identity fading into history within a few generations, exactly as had already happened to countless other conquered peoples throughout the region, including Israel's own vanished northern tribes barely a century earlier. The Babylonian exile forced the surviving population of Judah's political, religious, and intellectual elite, with the poorest agricultural labourers generally left behind in the devastated homeland, on a brutal forced march of well over 1,000 kilometres to a completely unfamiliar new life deep within the heart of the Babylonian Empire. Every conventional institution that had previously anchored Hebrew national identity had now been simultaneously stripped away. No king remained on any throne. No temple remained standing to serve as the physical centre of worship, and the ancestral homeland itself now lay firmly under direct foreign occupation and administration. By the established historical pattern that had already claimed the northern kingdom of Israel and that had claimed dozens of other conquered peoples across the wider region before them, this population should have gradually assimilated into the broader Babylonian population and effectively disappeared from history within 2 or 3 generations at most. Instead, something genuinely unprecedented happened. Deprived of every traditional institutional structure that had previously carried and reinforced Hebrew identity, the exiled community's religious and intellectual leadership responded with a remarkable act of deliberate cultural preservation. The systematic collection, editing, and consolidation of their scattered oral traditions, historical records, legal codes, and religious texts into an increasingly unified, coherent body of literature, the foundational core of what would eventually become the Hebrew Bible. Deprived of the physical temple that had previously served as the essential, irreplaceable center of religious practice, the exiled community adapted by developing entirely new religious institutions and practices, built instead around communal study, prayer, and the shared reading of sacred text. The historical origin of the synagogue as a religious and communal institution, a portable and reproducible model of worship that required no fixed temple location and could, crucially, travel wherever the scattered community itself happened to be located. This adaptation proved genuinely transformative and consequential. A national and religious identity that had previously been anchored entirely in physical geography, a specific king, a specific city, one singular and irreplaceable temple building, was, through this crisis, deliberately reconstructed instead around a portable, transmissible body of shared text and law that required no fixed territory or specific physical location to survive and be practiced. This was an entirely different kind of durability than any other exiled or conquered ancient population had previously managed to develop, and it would prove decisive for the community's survival across many centuries of subsequent upheaval still to come. The broader geopolitical situation shifted again in 539 BC, when Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon and inherited its vast empire, along with all of its previously subjugated, conquered populations. Cyrus's approach to imperial governance differed sharply and significantly from the harsh, often brutal policies of both his Assyrian and Babylonian predecessors. The Cyrus cylinder, a clay artifact discovered in the 19th century and often described as an early and remarkably progressive statement of policy regarding conquered and displaced peoples, records Cyrus permitting various exiled populations throughout his newly acquired empire to return to their original homelands and rebuild their traditional places of worship, a policy that directly enabled at least some portion of the exiled Hebrew community to begin making the long journey back to their ancestral homeland. Those who chose to return found a homeland transformed by decades of destruction and neglect, and their arrival generated immediate friction with the populations who had remained in the territory throughout the exile period, including the Samaritans in the north and various local populations who had continued occupying the land while the exiles were away. Under the determined leadership of figures including Ezra and Nehemiah, the returning community undertook the demanding work of rebuilding Jerusalem's protective walls and eventually reconstructing a second temple on the ruins of the first, while simultaneously enforcing increasingly strict standards of religious and ethnic identity, specifically intended to prevent the kind of gradual cultural dilution and assimilation that had already permanently erased the Northern Kingdom's population from history following its own earlier conquest and dispersal. What makes this particular story genuinely remarkable within the broader sweep of ancient Near Eastern history is not that Judah avoided military defeat. It plainly did not, suffering catastrophic conquest, mass deportation, and the total physical destruction of its central religious institution. What makes it remarkable is what happened afterward. Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon, every single empire that at various points conquered, dominated, or destroyed this small, comparatively insignificant highland kingdom, eventually collapsed themselves in turn, leaving behind little more than ruined cities, silent inscriptions, and broken stone monuments for archaeologists to eventually rediscover, excavate, and painstakingly decipher many centuries later. The people they had once conquered, deported, and by every reasonable historical expectation should have permanently erased from history through exactly this same familiar and repeated pattern of imperial conquest, instead survived that conquest and went on to shape the moral, legal, and religious imagination of a substantial portion of the entire modern world, not through the lasting strength of armies or the endurance of monumental architecture, but through the deliberate, determined survival of a written and continuously transmitted book.